One of the things that now it's official. Today is actually like less than 2 weeks before Purim. So I feel like we should also talk about Purim. But I always appreciate when people have questions and they have an opportunity to ask them. So I'm going to actually start off that way. So say if there are any questions that have been on your mind or haven't been on your mind, just want to ask, we'll be able to do that. And then we'll hopefully have some time for some Purim insights. Because Purim, I think everyone knows, but we can try to make it a little bit fun. Talk about all the curious tales of Purim. No pun intended for those of you who got that. Do you get that? Vashti, one of the things that they say about Vashti was that she had grown a tail. That's why she didn't show up to the party when her husband called for her. You see? Now, that's why I said the curious tales of Purim. No pun intended. Thank you guys for playing along over here. Henry, well, you don't know this one? That one you probably heard. No? Oh, I was talking about that Vashti grew a tail. You ever heard that? But not that one. Okay, I'm so happy that I can tell you guys another Misa. I don't want to use the word Baba Misa because it might be true. It's a medrash.
After she grew it, did she have it for the rest of her life?
Well, she was killed that night.
Okay.
She refused to show up.
Okay.
Because one of the reasons was her tail. If she had a tail, because of that, miraculous, whatever, you got to know all the stories.
So it was an outgrowth of the Cossack's tail, which we all know.
Right, exactly. It just kept growing at that moment.
Why are you making this sound logical?
This is what happens when you're a teacher, But yeah, you had a question at least you want to start with before we touch Purim?
Okay. The 10 big commandments, the 11th one.
What's the 11th one?
I don't know. And why is it subordinate so much to the first 10?
Okay, so to repeat that question, and this way we can ask others to share their thoughts on it. There are 10 commandments that we always talk about, like the most important. And then we also talk about 613 commandments, minus those 10 is 603 other commandments. So what was number 11 is what you want to know. And then why do we talk about these 10 specifically?
Why is the 11th so unimportant compared to the first 10?
Well, so first of all, it says that you cannot put an order to what is a more important commandment, mitzvah, than another. On the other hand, we do know that that it's totally important that these are 10 integral commandments. And they kind of have two, I'm going to say, categories of what they fall into. They are the mitzvot that are between us and God, the first 5, and they are the mitzvot that are between mankind. And it says that each one of them really relies on the other, right? You can't just have commandments between us and God and not really care about what's going on between mankind. You can't just have mankind if you don't believe in the God side, because let's say it says, do not commit murder. If you don't believe it's because of God, then you can rationalize murder at a certain point. So they have to work in tandem. Why these 10? Or why, to rephrase it, why isn't the 11th one in the 10? Is probably a better question. And I think that there's an answer that says that all commandments kind of stem from these 10, but I don't have an answer. There is no number that's 11. Do you know what I mean? We don't kind of organize them like that. These are the 10 that God gave to the Jewish people with his revelation. I want to use that word. Right? It was a revelation at Sinai. So these were the ones that are the core foundation. Yeah, you want to add something?
I was just wondering, is there any significance to the order of the commandments? I know that the first one is the first one.
Right.
So
Everything comes from that one.
I mean, here's one of them.
Right.
God starts with commandments, it would start with the meaning of God. But then the others, that people say they're divided in the first 5 and the last.
Right. So I'll tell you something interesting. You're asking a good question. They are on 2 tablets, right? They were on 2 different stones. And so I read this when we were reading the 10 Commandments a couple weeks ago, like in the Torah portions. There's 2 opinions. They read them across. So you'd start with number 1 and number 6. Or they read them down, the first 5 being the first tablet, and then down the next 5. So the explanation that I had shared that they rely on each other is that it was read across. One is connected to 6. I am the Lord your God, do not commit murder. Right? So again, these are just interesting. There's a lot of commentary on that. But I could Google it quickly and see what Rabbi Google comes up with. Wait. Yeah, go for it.
As a follow-up, you just said do not commit murder, but it doesn't mean do not kill. Am I
Correct, correct. I think a lot of people really point that word out. It says do not commit murder. Murder being an act that is forbidden, but killing sometimes is mandated. Like if someone tries to kill you, it says you should kill him first, right? Or someone who's trying to kill someone else. It's a rodef is the Hebrew term for that. Actively trying to kill someone, it's an obligation on our part to stop him. And if it means killing him to stop him, that is the mitzvah. You're doing a mitzvah. Wars, defending Jewish people, talking about October 7th, like you said earlier, is a mitzvah to defend Jewish life. Yeah.
I don't know where to go with the movies or not, the movie History of the World.
I have
Mel
watched.
Brooks,
Oh.
when he comes down from the, he's Moses, he comes down from the mountain. He's got 15 commandments and he drops and breaks one of them. And I've been in a couple of discussions with the classes where the question comes up, what were the 5 that he dropped?
So, it's funny. I know that story. It's more of a joke. The other joke that I always hear about the 10 Commandments is they went to it. There's a medrash that says that God went to every nation and offered them the Torah. And each one of them asked, what's in this Torah? And God would repeat or share one of the 10 Commandments. Do not steal. So he went to the Italians, for example. I'm just giving the example. He went to the Italians and he said, it says you cannot commit adultery. They said, forget it. We can't have that. They went to the Romans, said you do not commit murder. They said, forget it. We can't. Comes to the Jews and they say, how much is it? Free. We'll take 2. That's the joke I always heard. So, but yeah, the 10 Commandments is always, I think these are the core laws that make our society, I'm going to say, live well together, meaningfully, and then the rest are all derived from it to a degree. On the other hand, every single commandment is just, we don't start saying this is more important than that one. So it's a good question. There's more to that. I should probably research for you.
What's the 11th commandment?
There. Be a mensch.
I didn't ask.
The 11th commandment is to be a mensch. They share in yeshiva. If you open up every single volume of the Talmud, starts on page 2, not on page 1. And so they have this long-standing, I don't want to call it a joke, like meaningful kind of teaching that says, you know why it starts on page 2? Because page 1 is to be a mensch. You got to be a mensch before you start worrying about all the details of the Torah and the arguments of how they come to this. You got to be a mensch. So that's page 1. Derech Eretz, to say it in Hebrew, because I know you'll appreciate that. Derech Eretz kadma la Torah. To be a mensch comes before the Torah. The Torah is meant to make us into a mensch.
The purpose of the Torah.
Yeah, as I said, to make us into a mensch. So
So is that written on page 1?
no, it's the teacher teaching. You know what I mean? It's what they share. It's not a literal law written somewhere. Yeah.
The story of the matter that you mentioned, that the Jews didn't want to go on to, the fact is that the matter, if I remember correctly, that the Jews did not want the Torah, and it says kafara
Hold on. That's late. There is something to that. It's funny that we're having this conversation. This conversation usually happens before Shavuos. But what? No, you're good. You're good. We're talking about it. So it says that the Jewish people, there is a medrash that says God lifted up the mountain over the Jewish people and forced them to receive the Torah. And if they didn't, he said, I'll bury you right here under this mountain. It is actually appropriate to talk about this right now, and I'll explain to you why. It says that when the Jewish people celebrated Purim, it says that they accepted the Torah again, meaning we accepted it at Mount Sinai, but we were forced. Now we accepted it willingly. Right now we came to learn it and appreciate it on our own. And so it is an appropriate teaching. There is a lot of commentary on that specific idea. How could we have a Torah and be Jews because we were forced? That doesn't sound like the right thing. So there is a teaching, I'm using this one on purpose, that says, what does it mean we were forced? If you think about the revelations that happened to the Jewish people from Egypt, you have the 10 plagues, you have splitting of the sea, you had God revealing himself on Mount Sinai to every single Jew. Think about it. How can you not accept the Torah? You kind of were overpowered by awesome spirituality. So no one made a choice. It was kind of like so overpoweringly and overwhelming that you obviously you're going to be part of that. Only after the story of Purim did they kind of come to it without this revelation, where we were overwhelmed with a spiritual aspect. Purim, we didn't have that. Purim, we almost died. Stan, I'll take your question.
A question, actually, if you're a mensch, is it you're a mensch because you're following the Torah, or if you're a mensch, you don't really have to because you're automatically following the Torah?
That's you ready for the answer to that? Just to repeat the question. If you're a mensch, is it you're a mensch because you're following the Torah? Or if you're a mensch, you don't have to follow the Torah? It's actually a good question. I'll tell you why. Hillel and Rabbi Akiva both say that to love your fellow as yourself is the ultimate purpose and point of the Torah, and they phrase it differently.
Yeah.
Right? The first one phrased it that Hillel said, what you don't want done to yourself or what you hate done to yourself, don't do unto others. This is the entire Torah. That's how he phrases it. So he would kind of say exactly what you just said. Being a mensch is enough. That's the end all be all purpose. Don't worry about the details. Rabbi Akiva realized that that's not what he meant. Right? In the end of the day, you have to still do those mitzvot. And so instead of saying it's the entire Torah where we could come to the incorrect conclusion, which is kind of what you just shared, Rabbi Akiva rephrases it and says, this is a general rule of the Torah. Right? The Torah will help us get to there. It's not, you still have to do the mitzvah, you still have to keep Shabbat, whatever mitzvah you're talking about. So that's a very good question. And if we only had Hillel's statement, we could come to the incorrect conclusion. So yeah, it's a good question. The point is the Torah will help us be a mensch. The Torah also tells us that there are values that are most important, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily go with what we consider being a mensch, right? Sometimes you might say better to do the wrong thing than to embarrass somebody. But that's not how the Torah phrases it, right? Find the most gentlest way to tell the person that you can't do it because it's not of a Jewish value to you is probably a better way to do it than say it. So it's not about compromising on our values, but it's about allowing our values to lift ourselves up. That's kind of how I say, we don't bring the Torah down to us, we try to lift up to the Torah, if I can use that terminology. It's not always easy.
And also the saying that there is that within its own context, it's not quite clear that he didn't mean this is enough. He said, this is what you do, go study the rest. Which means, you can't say, I misunderstood.
Well, I hear what you're saying, just to repeat that. So when Hillel said it to this potential convert, was he saying, I'm teaching you all this, now go study the rest? Or was he saying, the guy asked specifically, teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot? So most people interpret that saying that, okay, the entire Torah is loving your fellow as yourself, or what you don't want done to yourself, don't do unto others. So I do understand both, right? That's a good question, yeah.
Somebody asked me the question one point, are you religious?
How do you answer it?
Said, how do you define?
Oh. So what's the question? What do you answer after that?
I said that they realize that
Right.
everyone has their own definition. If I study Torah, come to classes to learn, go to the synagogue every week, give charity, become part of the community. But I don't keep kosher. Am I religious?
So you want to know my answer? I'll tell you, the question was, how do we define, I'm rephrasing it, religious? If somebody says, are you religious? I appreciated something. Last week, the Federation had this speaker from Jew Belong, and she is, if you, to just share who she is, her name is Archie Gottesman. And if you see all those very, I'm going to say, in your face Jewish billboards throughout the United States, they're pink and black typically. They stand out. They're very in your face. Like, I should probably get some of her quotes, but like one of them is, you can do something about this billboard can't do anything about anti-Semitism. You can, or something like that. And it has other ones as well. So very, very, I'm going to say eye-catchy quotes. Some people like it, some people don't. But her whole point is that in the community, this is what she shared. She used a pie chart. She's like, there are traditional Jews, or maybe connected Jews, I think she used, observant Jews, and then everyone else. She's going after the everyone else, right? The people who are not engaged. But how did she define observant? So I'm sitting next to a guy, and he's like, we both see the chart, he's like, that's you. And then she defines it, and she says, observant is somebody who sends their kids to Jewish day school, or this guy also does. Meaning, we typically hear the word observant, we think kosher, we think Shabbos, so it's very exclusive. She uses the word observant very inclusive. I kind of like that. I thought it was a nice little play on the word. I typically will say, like, how do you define somebody? Like, if I want to say we're talking about Jewish people who are engaged in synagogue life, I say synagogue life very broadly, right? It doesn't mean they're keeping kosher or Shabbos, but they're engaged Jewishly. I would say they're traditional. That's kind of the word I use. I don't really use the word religious. I know it's used so often, so by default comes into the way we talk. But I use observant typically, like the Shabbos and kosher. That's kind of how I'll use it. But I kind of liked how she flipped the script. It's like, why do we even have to define people? You could say they're follow. It's a tricky thing, because you want to be inclusive, and words are very exclusive sometimes. So I kind of appreciate how she did it. She broadened who is considered observant, which puts us in a category more united than divided. I typically don't use the word religious. A lot of people are religious, right? Like you said, if you're engaged in communal life, why can't you consider yourself religious? If we're going to use the word religion and say it's not all or nothing, then if you go to shul or you go to classes and you don't go to services, why can't you be considered religious? Or you keep kosher and never do anything else Jewishly. There are people like that too. Right? So engaged is kind of how I use the word a lot, Jewishly engaged, which is kind of what you described. Right? We're not defining that you have to check 10 boxes to be considered religious or observant. It's not how it works.
I like that.
Like, it's on the phone, on my way here, someone said, oh, you're Orthodox. Her brothers are Orthodox. That's how it started. So I said, is that good or bad? Like, what, how are you using this? Do you like them or not? Because, that's kind of how it came out. Yeah.
Just want to make a comment. I thought that people who live in Israel, it is as if they do 50% of Jewish religion, or 50% of the mitzvah, which means even if they don't choose the other 50, you can't exclude them from being
In the,
religious.
wait, you're saying 50% do it just by default?
Yeah, another, if you live.
Because it's easy.
I would-
Yeah, I don't know. It's possible. I kind of appreciate when Judaism, living Jewishly is easier, people do it. Right? If kosher was so accessible here, and yes, it is, but I mean even more accessible, right? And the prices were at a point where people like them. People will do kosher because if it's in front of you, why wouldn't you do it? So I totally understand that. On the other hand, for us in Arizona, at least, you have to go out of your way just a bit to do kosher. Trader Joe's has kosher and a couple, but it's not, there isn't like in the supermarket a deli counter like they have in Las Vegas or San Diego, Chicago, exactly. Stan, you had another question. Go for it.
Well, I just lost my train of thought.
All right, you'll let me know when it comes back. You'll chime back in.
Yes,
So were you saying that just by living in Israel?
oh,
That's my understanding,
I kind of believe that, right? Because just to go back to the 50% Israel, kosher is so accessible there. Most restaurants, even if they don't have a kosher certification, are kosher. Why do I say that? They might not have a certification because they're open on Saturday. And that's one of the things. Now, obviously, if they sell pork, that's another conversation. But a lot of these restaurants have kosher food. Shabbos, like by default, maybe that's the 50% that they're not keeping or whatever it is, but it might be that they are keeping it. They're just not going to shul. They're traditional. They're not working. The work is kind of closed in Israel. It's so much easier. Now, of course, you could be the person who actively, defiantly does not do it. There are those. Israel has a very special, I should say Judaism has a very special category of like anti-religious. You don't find that in other religions. They just, whatever. Here they're like, to use the Hebrew word lahachiz. They do it like in spite. Yeah, ladafka. Same idea. Like, we're gonna make sure we do that. So you're gonna have that in Israel too, but people are all, I think if we go back to a Rosh Hashanah point, we talk about every single Jewish person is filled with mitzvot like the seeds of a pomegranate. Mitzvot come easy. There's a lot of things that we're always doing that are mitzvot, and we didn't even try for that. So yeah, I do believe that. I don't know where that statistic is from, but
the fact is that Talmud says a thought that a lot of mitzvot are dependent on Israel. A lot of mitzvot you can't do here at all.
right. But that would not apply. So Israel mitzvah, which is what you're referring to, many of them don't apply today either. A lot of them have to do with the temple. Some of them have to do with the tithings, which they still do, right? They still do that, but not all tithings, right? There are tithings that had to do with temple time, specifically eating your fruit in Jerusalem. That doesn't apply today. Bikurim. So it was more about the Shemitah tithings and Maser. There was a couple tithings that were specific. Right. So for me, going to Israel 2 summers ago was actually quite fascinating. Not just Israel being Israel, but it was a Shemitah year and sabbatical year. So the sabbatical year of the 7-year cycle within Judaism says that year you don't use your field. And if you don't use your field that year, you're left with no crop, right? Or you're left with crops that other people can take, is really like it. So it's an interesting, I read something really interesting, like a story, but it was interesting to see this. Basically, up to a certain day, you can work these fields. A lot of trees, if you haven't thinned them, taken off a lot of the fruit that have come on, the storms will ruin your tree because it's so heavy, the whole tree will fall off. So a lot of people need to thin it by a certain day. One year, a guy couldn't do that for whatever reason. So he asked his rabbi, give me permission. It's after the day. It's after that deadline on the Jewish calendar. There's got to be something. I'm going to ruin my entire life and livelihood is based on these trees surviving through this year. I'm not allowed to work on them. So the rabbi said, listen, there's nothing I can tell you like on the Torah that allows you to do it. So he doesn't do it. There is a massive storm. Other people go and do it, right? They're not as careful. They're worried for their trees. So they thin their trees. There's a massive storm. Any thinned tree was too light to stand up to these winds. His trees that saw the fruit, the winds knocked the fruit off, but the trees, survived. Again, these are just interesting things that we don't even have to like grapple with such a decision. It's not our world. Stan, now you're ready. What's up?
yes, I remembered years ago, there was a gentleman who was very religious, and it was a Jewish neighborhood, and he went to services Saturday morning, and if he saw people outside who weren't coming to the service, he would curse at them. He didn't even know if they were Jewish, but it was a Jewish neighborhood. He would curse them, but he considered himself religious. So, God,
That's a problem with every community. Just because you're religious doesn't mean you're a mensch.
right. And to me, being a mensch is, the most critical thing.
I'll tell you, but that shouldn't take you away from doing the other stuff.
No.
I'll tell you something interesting that I always remember. I went into Westminster Village. This is probably 10 years ago or more. For those of you who remember, Israel had a story of a young Jewish girl, maybe 12, I don't know how old she was, and a man spits on her in the street because she's not
Yes,
dressed.
she wasn't
modestly
covered
enough.
up enough.
Correct. That story might happen very often, but this was a story that made international news. A lady, I come into Westminster, she's holding a magazine and like stuffs it into my chest and says, what do you say to this? And so I read the story quickly. I don't have an answer. I can't excuse someone's bad behavior. But then I read the story some more, not from her magazine. I go online. It was a religious guy who spit on a religious girl. It wasn't like a non-religious girl who was spit on. This is like a problem within the religious community itself. And so, which is just as bad, don't get me wrong. I thought it was like so interesting. She had put it on me as if it's like religious versus anti-religious. And the story is terrible. I'm not getting into that part, but like we have our own problems, to come back to what you were saying, that we have to work on. It's not just the other that's not caring about others. It's within our own community we have these problems. We're not here to air our dirty laundry, but yeah.
So what about Purim?
So what about Purim? Any last questions before that? I know you're on a time frame. I like this. Any other questions before I touch Purim? Of course, free space. Restaurants.
Everything there was kosher, McDonald's, this, that. I mean, but it's so different, it was different in Pittsburgh.
Right. I think it might be getting better here, but just to repeat the question, she just moved here from, it's Carol, right?
Yes.
Carol just moved here from Pittsburgh, but she has the East Coast blood. And so over there, everything kosher, you can find many kosher eateries. Here, it's like everything's kosher style. I think people are less engaged Jewishly, to use that word. But they still have it's their culture. So there's foods that are part of their culture, but aren't necessarily kosher. My dad has this thing, we're very close to the Chompies like owners, and he always tells them, he's like, Passover, you do so much catering. Buy kosher meat just for Passover. It's going to so many Jewish homes. And it's not easy because the price points are difficult for them. My dad's not even telling them to kosher their restaurant. He's saying they'll have a kosher meat rather than a non-kosher meat. But kosher style is twofold. One is people like deli and deli fare. And maybe that's a little bit of a guilt. They feel like they're doing something a little bit more Jewish when they're in a deli. You can't answer for each person. But I can tell you that if it's something that bothers you, just don't eat the Reuben sandwich. You know what I mean? All right. Well, the deli, I don't know if they have a cheeseburger, but you can always do fish. And I tell people also as well, like if you want to do the best that you can, you start in small steps. So don't have the horse meat or the alligator meat. Have the cow, have the beef from the cow. You know what I mean? At least you got the kosher animal and grow from there. And I know I shared this here many times. I share it all the time. You could choose one day of the week that's my kosher day for sure. Right? If you eat kosher other days, that's not a problem. But this way you kind of engage yourself with those values that you care about that maybe slipped away or haven't really been focal in your life. So on Wednesdays, you don't go to Chompies, you go to Milk and Honey in the JCC. Do you know what I mean? Or all the other restaurants that are, hopefully some more will open, but yeah, we don't have a mecca for restaurants. But that's kosher style, right? Yeah.
The
So-
Reuben sandwich was named after a restaurant.
Oh, not after a Jewish guy who liked it?
There was a restaurant in New York, it was called Rubens. It was around the corner from where I was working, and they were finally closed up because of health considerations.
Really? Health considerations or the
Yeah,
health?
their sanitation and
Okay,
restaurants that are
no, because
inspected.
health considerations means something else.
No, okay, no.
You know, like there's the Heart Attack Grill in Phoenix. If it closes because too many heart attacks, that's health considerations. If it
That
closes
probably
'cause
would have been true
tax
too.
droppings, that's health inspector.
If you eat a lot of Reuben sandwiches, it can kill you.
You probably could. All right, for Purim, for you ready? For all of us. So one of the fascinating things about Purim that I think many of us know, but I'm going to kind of focus on, and I'm going to try to keep this the cliff notes of the story with additional commentaries that I find quite fascinating about the story. Number one is Purim is the only time in Jewish history that every single Jewish individual was under one ruler, which means that the decree to kill the Jews was very different than what we have known throughout our history, and going to the most recent time that we've really seen death and killing of Jews, which we'll talk about, let's say the Holocaust, that only affected countries that those tyrants, including Hitler and Mussolini and whoever else, were connected to. But if you lived in America, that decree didn't happen. If you lived in Israel, well, I shouldn't use Israel. If you lived in many other countries in South America or South Africa or wherever it was, you didn't have that threat. Purim was the only time in our history that all Jews were under the threat of annihilation. So let that set in for a moment. We celebrate Hanukkah. That wasn't a story about killing Jews. That was a story about killing religion. Eventually, it ends up in a war. But it wasn't that the original threat against the Jewish people was, we're going to kill you. The story of, I'm going to use Egypt, for example, wasn't killing Jews, it was enslaving Jews. Yes, there was also death involved with that, the firstborns, not the firstborn, the boys. But again, it wasn't a threat of death. This is the only time in our history that the Jewish people were under the threat of death. And because of that, there's a lot of commentary on like, wait, why? What did we do that could truly give God the reason to allow a death threat on all Jewish people to come into play? So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I'm just going to do the cliff notes of the story. Purim begins with Ahasuerus is a king over 127 countries or nations. The Jewish people lived throughout all of these. It is right after, it's about 70 years after the Jewish people were exiled from Israel by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was a king. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. I'm using the Hebrew pronunciation. How do you say it? Okay. So I'm using the Hebrew pronunciation, but same guy. And so one of the things that they have is a prophecy that says 70 years later, the Jewish people are going to be returned to the land of Israel. That's something that they have. And so the premise of the story begins with a party. They're celebrating, and the Jewish people are invited to the party as well. At that party, Ahasuerus, I'm doing the cliff notes, I'll come back to commentaries. Ahasuerus asks his wife to come to the men's side of the party and show her body off. She refuses. That night they kill her. The next morning he wakes up sober and he's like, what did I do? Right, I'm not giving any commentary yet. Why do they kill her though? I always find this quite fascinating. If you look in the story, it says, what are all the other husbands? How are they going to control their wives? They're all going to learn from the queen. She refused to listen to her husband. All the husbands in your world, 127 countries, are going to have a problem now. Their wives are not going to listen to them. We have to do something about it. And so they punish Vashti to make an example of women who don't listen to their husbands. Think about it. He is sad when he wakes up. They make a beauty pageant. Esther, who is Jewish but has not told anyone of the pageant kind of people and of the king's palace, wins. During that time, Mordecai, who is her uncle, Mordecai the Jew is the first time the Jewish people are called Jews. You used to be called a Jew if you're from the tribe of Judah, right? Yehudi, that makes sense. But in the story of Purim, we learn he is not from the tribe of Judah. He is actually from the tribe of Benjamin. and he is called a Jew. That is the origin for all of us being called Jews. Side note. So basically it comes up that after she becomes queen, Mordecai would hang around the palace a lot just to make sure she's good, find out what's going on. He overhears two guards who are plotting to kill the king. They speak a different language than the Persian that everyone else speaks, so they thought he doesn't understand. He reports it. The king is saved. It's found to be true. They write it down in a document that Mordecai the Jew saved the king's life. And within all this process of Vashti being killed, there is a person who is promoted, and that is Haman. Haman is now second in command to the king. You have to bow down when you see him. Mordecai never bows down to him because he has a cross. Not a cross in those days. He had like an idol on his that he wore, and Mordecai refused to bow down because it would look like he's bowing down to an idol. That made Haman very upset. He hatches this plan with his wife to kill all the Jews. He comes to Ahasuerus and he offers him 10,000 talents of silver. It is a huge amount of money for the permission to kill the Jews. I'm not sure if that amount of money was because you're going to lose all that revenue in taxes or whatever it is. He's willing to pay for this. The king says, you can keep your money. Here's my ring. Put that into action. The date that they settle on is through a lottery, which is how the story of Purim gets its title. Pur, P-O-R. Sorry, P-U-R, or in Hebrew, Pei Vav Resh, means a lottery. So he casts lots to figure out what day is the best day in the, I'm going to say horoscopes and mazzles and constellations to kill the Jewish people, that God won't be able to kind of defend them, which is a really interesting concept in general for another conversation maybe. And they figure out that the month of Adar, which is the month we're in, is the best month. Why? Because this month, Moshe, our leader in the desert and from Egypt, died in this month. So they see that as a bad sign. The problem is they don't realize that Moshe also was born in this month, which is a good sign. So anyways, the story plays out that when the Jewish people hear about this decree, they immediately begin to repent. They were at that time clearly not in the best, I'm going to say, of actions. They turn their lives around. They start to ask God for forgiveness. And Mordecai tells Esther, maybe this is the reason why you became queen, just to fix this problem. You have to go to the king and ask to save our lives. We have 3 days of fasting that all the Jewish people do. That is known as the fast of Esther. The actual date that the fast happened in its real life was over Passover. We fast, we connect it to the story, so we typically have that fast day the day before Purim. This year, Purim begins on a Sunday. We don't fast on Saturdays unless it's Yom Kippur. And so we push that to Thursday. So next week, Thursday is a fast day. It is the fast of Esther. Now, that fast, after she fasts, she goes into the king's chamber without being invited. And that is a very big threat of death, because if the king doesn't like you, he was a real king, not like the British monarch. He can say off with your head. So if you're uninvited and you don't belong there. So she was very nervous about that. She goes, she asks the king to join her and Haman for a feast, a dinner. And so the king says yes. Haman is invited. During this time, though, Haman is still upset at Mordecai. For some reason, he just can't get over the fact that the guy doesn't bow down to him. So he says, even though I got permission that all the Jews will be killed in about a year, Mordecai, we got to get rid of. And so he comes home to his wife. They devise a plan, build a gallows, 50 feet tall. It's even more than that. I think it's about 200. It's cubit feet tall. So it's around 200 feet, I think, is the measurement.
If it's 18.
No, is it? But I think over here it's like I'll check. It's a biblical measurement. But either way, it's a very tall gallows, over 100 feet tall. And he comes into the king in the middle of the night. He's so excited. That night, the king can't sleep. And he asks that the royal scribe read from the book of records. And they're reading through the book. This is what the king does when he can't sleep. And they read the story how Mordecai saved the king's life. And just at that moment, oh, and the king says, did we give him a reward? He says, no. Just at that moment, Haman comes and knocking at the middle of the night to ask about hanging Mordecai. The king says, hey, what would you do to somebody who I want to honor? She says, well, I would take you, thinking that it's himself. He's a narcissist. Says, I would tell him he should be paraded on the king's horse using the king's crown and paraded around the city saying, this is what should be done to them. This is what is done to the man whom the king wishes to honor. Says, perfect. Take the horse, don't take the crown. He removes that. And do that to Mordecai the Jew. Comes home that night, he's feeling very dejected. There is a commentary that says during that march, his own daughter thought that Haman was probably on the horse and somebody else was marching the horse. So she took a pail of garbage. In those days, that was their toilet, and dumps it out the window onto the person marching in front of the horse, which is her own father. So he comes home, he's very dejected, but he has to run to the party. Runs to the party, and what happens? She tells the king, there, please, you have to save my life. She says, what do you mean? What happened? She says, there is a person who wants to kill my people, which means me too. And so he says, who? She says, Haman. So Haman realizes what's going on over there. The king also, he goes out for fresh air. He's like, this is so much for him to handle. Haman begins pleading for his life and falls on top of Esther. The king walks back in. He says, not only do you want to kill her while I'm in the house, you want to do it? And Haman is obviously hung. That's the outcome of that. The Jewish people are not able to just rescind the decree. The king can't just say, forget that decree. It's just not how it works. They write a new decree that says the Jewish people can defend themselves on that day. Comes time to the 14th. What happens? The Jewish people in all the cities except for Shushan, which is the capital city, they complete the job. They actually defend themselves from their enemies. They feel safe. In Shushan, though, there's a lot more haters. And so it takes longer than a day. They do one more day. So when you look at the story of Purim, if you live anywhere other than Jerusalem, you celebrate Purim this year on Sunday. If you live in Jerusalem, Old City, you celebrate it on Monday. Because any city that was walled, fully surrounded by walls during the times of Shushan, celebrated Purim on day number 2. And so in Israel, if you go to Israel, you could celebrate Purim. If you're in Jerusalem, you could celebrate on Monday. If you're anywhere else, you celebrate it on Sunday. That's kind of the basis of the story. The outcome was afterwards, they enacted a couple of things for celebrating it. Number 1 is listen to the story on Purim. We read the Megillah. Number 2 is have a festive meal. Celebrate God's graciousness and miraculous, even though the miracle is within nature. I'll explain that in a minute. Number 3 is foster a sense of community. You do that with gifts of food, the mishloach manot, shalach manis, depending on how you pronounce it, and gifts to the poor of money, which we in Hebrew call it matanot levyonim. These are the ways that we celebrate Purim. So just using us, for example, on Sunday, we're doing a party here at the JCC. You get to do all of those mitzvot at once, right? There's a festive meal in general means you have bread. But even if you don't wash, you're having a meal for Purim. You listen to the Megillah, we'll do that. You'll have an opportunity to give shalach manas. We have a kind of an exchange program here. And there's charity boxes where you can put coins in, or you can give to any charity that you know that gives to the poor. So those are the ways we celebrate Purim. Purim is a fascinating holiday. There isn't like one massive miracle that you can point to and say, oh, that's why the Jews were saved. Right? Hanukkah is a miracle. The weak defeated the mighty. But Purim doesn't have that. It's all like natural coincidences, if you would like to believe that kind of go in lockstep until you have an outcome that works well, right? So because of that, because it is a miracle that happens through natural means, we actually look at it as a greater miracle. Because for God to do something beyond nature, okay. But for God to use nature to kind of bring out the miracle is more wow. That's how we look at it. So now, coming back to this, The story of Purim is also with cookies, right? We do pastries, Hamantashen. Hamantashen are actually teaching this exact idea. A real pastry Hamantash, you don't see the filling. You take a bite out of it, you find the sweetness. That's the same thing with the story. You could look at this story and it's just a nice story. You don't really see the hand of God. But if you take a bite out of the story, you see that the internal mechanism that created this all was God. And so that's kind of why the Hamantash became a food of the holiday. It also, according to many people, was given that name because Haman had a three-cornered hat. Either he did or he didn't. Some people say he had three-cornered ears. Either he did or he didn't. Think about it. It's called Oznei Haman in Hebrew. Ozen means an ear. But Hamantash is actually a play on a German word of a tash. Taschen were pocket-filled pastries. Man is a filling, poppy seed. Haman, tash, is the play on Haman and tash. So I just share that as a side note. Here are some of the interesting things of the story that I'll just share some insights. So number one is, why were we given a decree of death? It's pretty strong, like, what did we do? So the Talmud discusses this and says, we enjoyed the feast of Achashverosh. The question is, why would that be a death penalty? Why would all the Jews be deserving of being annihilated? And so there's a debate on that, but I'll just share one of the explanations. So I had mentioned that the Jewish people partook of a feast. What was Achashverosh celebrating? He was celebrating this idea that, 70 years have passed and they were not returned to Jerusalem. Let's bring out all of the spoils of the temple. And so on the one hand, you can say that the Jewish people celebrating with Achashverosh was actually us celebrating the downfall of Jerusalem. The thing is why should that warrant a death penalty? So you're right that it's a very bad thing for Jews to celebrate our own destruction. So maybe you want to punish the people that were at the feast, but not everyone was at the feast. And also, why are we punishing the children? Well, we don't obligate children in mitzvot like that until they're older. So why would they be punished? Like, this was a complete annihilation of all Jews. And so one of the answers that's given, which I'm going to share, is that the Jewish people have always been likened, you find this in the Talmud a lot, to a nation that is considered a sheep among 70 wolves. Wolves eat sheep. And the only reason why we are still here is because God, the shepherd, protects us. And so we don't worry about the wolves because God is with us. What happens, though, if you go to a party and you say, I've made it. The wolf, Achashverosh, invited me to the party. I have him. I'm in his good graces. So it's not that God punished the Jews and said, you're going to die for that. What it is that we kind of moved away from God's protection. We say, we don't need you. We have, this wolf is going to protect us. The thing is that he's a wolf. And so naturally, if God removes his protection, the default is, the way the world works is the wolves eat sheep. And so we weren't punished with death. The natural means of the world took over. And that is that the sheep are not protected from wolves. With that, I'm going to come to the kind of how this plays out at the end. How do we win? How does the story turn? Esther fasts for 3 days. She is worried that her husband, Achashverosh, can potentially say, I don't want you in here. Who invited you here? You're dead. Technically, she should have been eating healthily, put on some great makeup, and made sure she looked beautiful. She did the counterintuitive thing to go into the king. She fasted for 3 days. You can imagine she would have been pale, weak. 3 days is not we don't do that. So she showed that, no, I am relying on God by going into that chamber and asking for that meeting. She showed that, no, we do have you. We do trust you and need you. Right? I'm not going to do all the thing, but of course, at the same time, she went into the king. She did the actions that you have to do. Right? We talk about this in general. God gives his blessings through it's not miraculous. We get miraculous blessings through tangible actions. You have to work. You have to go to work. You got to get a job. You can't just sit back and say God's going to provide. So Esther showed through her actions that on the one hand, she realized the blessings come from God. She went in fasting. On the other hand, she made an actual action by going into the king's chamber and asking him to save the Jewish people. When God saw that, the script flips again, and God comes back in to protect us. So it wasn't like a physical punishment. You are going to die because you participated in this feast, which we should have been at the feast, right? You have to do the actions, but you can't go to the feast saying, we made it, right? It's important to have the diplomacy. You're invited, the king, you're in his country. So it's important to be there. But how do you view your presence? Do you view your presence as part of the natural diplomacy we have to do because we live in a country and you have to do the things that show that you appreciate that? Or do you do it because we made it in life? We don't need God anymore. We don't need this extra special protection. And so it's important that we always know our balance. On the one hand, we have to do our thing. We have to have the relationships and I'm going to say relationships with all these different entities, whether it's politicians or other faiths, however each community does it, right? That's important. You have to do the natural means of relationships that will protect you and help you. But on the other hand, you have to never forget that our blessings truly come from God. And so the story of Purim really brings out that point, which is why in the beginning of the story, we kind of went off of that idea. And at the end of the story, we kind of come back to that idea. We act it. And so that is the kind of the hidden reason of why we were punished. Again, instead of using the word punished, why a decree like that was able to happen. On that note, there are a lot of really interesting kind of parts to the story that when you go to Hebrew school, you learn some of them, like the tale. It says that Vashti, if it's not a tale, she had boils. It said she like broke out in pimples or boils. She didn't feel comfortable going to the men's party to show her body off because at that point she had an event, a medical event or a miraculous event, whatever it was. That's one story. That's two, right? Either a boils or a tail. It said Esther was olive-skinned. Green skin is how I always, like when I was in Hebrew school, it was like, yeah, she had green skin. Never understood that. But it's just one of the things that they share. And so throughout the story, if you read through it, it is quite fascinating. Why did Mordecai know so many languages? So Mordecai, it says, was of the 70 judges on the great court, and many of them knew 70 languages. So he was in the right place at the right time, right? There's no such thing as coincidence. And so he overheard their language that he didn't speak, that no one else spoke in the capital. But there is a book called Torah Anthology, or if you want to go with like a little bit step down on that, the Medrash says, or if you want to go with another step down on that, the little Medrash says. They're kind of written for different ages to a degree. And when you read the story of Purim in there, you get like a whole added story of what was going on in Shushan, and it's fascinating. And that's kind of how, like, as kids, you learn some of the stories, like the tale would be in there. Yeah.
The heroine of the story is a Jewish woman who married out of her faith.
Correct. See what you're asking.
That seems to go.
Right. So good question. Right. If you really follow the story, Esther, who is Jewish, marries a non-Jew, and that's not allowed in Judaism. So this is a very big question that people kind of ask, like, wait, how was she allowed to? So number one is the short answer that I think is the quickest answer is that at the threat of death, we put the Torah on the side, right? The Torah says, live by these commandments, don't die by these commandments. So one answer that's given immediately is if she would have refused, she would have been put to death. So she was in a position that she was allowed to be in that. The question is, after she wins, right? She gets the job done. Should she have divorced? Could she have divorced? Right? Would that have been detrimental to everything that she had achieved? So there are a lot of questions about that. I will share a story that I've shared many times. I went to a retirement community, probably my first year or second year living back here, so maybe 2010. And a woman comes over to me, she says, how come she was allowed to marry a non-Jew? I shared this answer I just shared. And she says, thank you. She asks every rabbi this question because when she was growing up in Chicago, she went to Hebrew school. She asked the rabbi this question and he slapped her across the face. And she said, ever since then, she stopped going to Hebrew school. So, no problem. So, like, I realized when I heard that story that how important and how sad that a rabbi ruined this entire woman's Judaism, kept her away from it. And because of that, her family too, right? She just didn't feel comfortable because of that. My pleasure. Take care. And so we have to be so careful how we answer to people. But that was the question that he slapped her. How dare you ask such a question?
But did he know that he didn't know?
No. Oh, Achashverosh, no. No, but we're talking about on Esther's side. How is she allowed to? Yeah, yes.
Mother was extremely religious. The daughter of a holy man in Poland, right? And I remember she said, you can always break a commandment if it involves the health or safety.
Right. And that's based off of this verse that says, live by these commandments.
So that might be the 11th, 12th commandment.
There are exceptions, by the way. There are 3 exceptions to that.
That's the comment about Purim and Hanukkah.
Yes.
The biggest difference between them is Purim, government was on the side of the Jews. Hanukkah, obviously.
Which government? The Jewish government?
No. The governing.
Oh.
The government.
The Greeks.
Was on the side of the Jews. They say, go ahead, do whatever you need to do.
Oh, at the end of the story. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the miracle.
Right.
Hanukkah, the miracle was, no, we did it.
Right. It's from the people.
And that's why Hallel is so Hanukkah, not important. Because I think Hanukkah is a real miracle. We, the people, got up and did what.
Interesting. In other words, we went again. I understand what you're saying.
So, what you do is go ahead, keep going, encourage to do it. So it's complete.
So is it you're saying people celebrate it differently because of that, or not necessarily? It's just
We celebrate it differently. We don't say Hallelujah, we do say Hallelujah every day.
right.
Whatever excuse you give.
Right. No, that's an interesting. Just to add, I'm just repeat it here. So just the difference between Hanukkah and Purim, that Hanukkah was a victory and a miraculous victory that was literally the people on their own. The government had nothing to do with it, right? The government was the Greeks. We were fighting against the government. Whereas in the Purim story, at the end of the story, who helps us? The government, right? Achashverosh says, go and take care of this problem. So therefore, possibly this is why Purim and Hanukkah have actually a little bit difference in a celebration part, which is that on Hanukkah we recite Hallel, which is the prayer of gratitude and thanks. On Purim we don't. But I've never heard that. It's an interesting thing.
What, that's just a,
Yeah, no, I'm saying I wonder if that's the reason or another reason.
I don't know, I'm guessing. I'm with you guessing.
Yeah, no, we should look it up.
Purim. When does Purim occur in years based on the Gregorian?
So I am going to, I'm going to Google it, but I know that it's after the destruction of the first temple, which means we're in the before Common Era. This is, I'll tell you exactly, year that Purim occurred.
So if we have 2 months of the dark, are we having 2 Purims?
There is what they call Purim Katan, but it's not celebrated the same way. Like the small Purim, it's a joyous day, but we don't do anything.
No pumpkin patch?
You could. I would have had. It already happened. It happened in the 4th century before the Common Era. So let's get the exact year. Correct. Yeah. I'm trying to get the year here, but it's just saying on the ones I'm looking at quickly. Hold on. You know, we're just gonna have to go to Wikipedia. Actually, it doesn't say the exact day. I'll have to look soon. I don't see it here. But it's in the 4th century, before the Common Era. Oh, here we go. Ready? Here is the Purim table of dates. Ahasuerus ascends to the throne of Persia in the year 3392, Jewish calendar, 369 before the Common Era. The feast, which is 180 days, I didn't include that detail. It's a huge feast. Was 3 years later. What?
It lasted?
Yeah. That was in the year 366. Esther becomes queen in the year 362, but I want to share these dates now a little bit more because you'll see how long. So that's 362 in the month of Tevet. About 5 years later is when Haman's decree happens, when he casts lots. And that very same year, on the 13th of Nisan, so it's 2 days before Passover, he sends out all the messages to all the cities to say, hey, you can kill the Jews in a year's time. The next 3 days, literally the next 3 days, 14th, 15th, and 16th of that year, the Jewish people fast, the fast of Esther. On the 17th day, we're talking about 4 days after the decree, Haman is hung. So rapid events right after the decree happens. And it's only about 2 months later that the second decree, which reverses the first, comes out. And then, like we said, the following year, on the 13th of Adar, is when the 10 sons are executed. And which means that we have kind of taken care of our enemies. So the following day, which is the 14th day, is the day that we celebrate Purim. And if you lived in Shushan, you celebrated a day later because you didn't finish the job. The Megillah is only written the following year and instituted as a holiday. And let me see something. There's an asterisk here. There's a disagreement regarding this date. Okay, when did Haman get hung? I said it was 4 days after his decree. That is following the Talmudic opinion. But there is another alternative opinion on that. Interesting stuff. Now we can celebrate it. We got a week and a half. But anyways, that's Purim in the nutshell that I shared. No nuts on Purim, so that's no pun intended. Anyways, the reason why we get dressed up, I should share this part, is for the same reason why the Hamantash is kind of a pocket-filled pastry. Jewish people are kind of symbolizing the idea that the miracle happened behind the mask. You don't see God, right? You don't know who's behind the costume. And so if you look at the story, you got to kind of remove the mask to see the miracle. That's the idea. With that, we will conclude our discussion today. And hopefully